Mohammed, welcome to Northeast Ohio. We're very happy to have you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. It's such an honor to speak today to you in this amazing group. I already love the vibes of the people in the room. Brother Eric and I have been friends now for about a decade and a half. And I remember when we began correspondence, his first thought as he saw the atrocities unfolding in Gaza is, how can I come over and bear witness to this and report on this to the American people? He tried with huge determination to make the trip to Gaza and be on the ground in solidarity with the people there. Unfortunately, we learned the hard way that Israel does not allow any people into Gaza, with very few exceptions back then. And now the case is Israel does not allow anybody into Gaza. But his determination and passion for this topic has been truly inspiring over the years, and his support for me from a very early time when my English was pure garbage, and he would always praise it at the time. And I think that confidence that he gave me back then is one of the reasons why it improved over time. And then I gained trust in my communication skills and started speaking more often. So I truly appreciate your support, and it's been truly inspiring to be friends for that time. I was asked today to comment about three things. So first is my personal background and story in Gaza and in Palestine. The second is where are things today on the ground in Gaza? And the third is how are things moving forward? Is there any place for action? So in terms of background, I would start by saying my grandfather, like most Palestinians, the overwhelming majority of the Palestinian people, was uprooted and kicked out of his village violently in 1948. It's a small village called Hamama. It's very close to the Gaza Strip. I think it's about 20 minutes from Gaza by car. And it was famous for two things, fish and fig trees. They loved these, they worshiped them. My grandfather and father and his family, when they were kicked to Gaza, the first thing they did was plant a fig tree from a small sapple and watch it grow. And they built their house, or back then it was an aluminum shack. They built it around that particular tree to remind them of their village. A few years later, 1967, Israel invades Gaza, occupies it, and kicks my grandfather, my father, and uncles to Egypt. They were given a choice between Egypt, Sinai, and Libya. Basically, Israel back then kicked out, I think, about 38,000 people out of Gaza, and they continued to kick more thousands of people over the years that followed. So they lived in the Egyptian countryside, destitute and poor. And again, the first thing that they did when they moved there was to plant a fig tree to remind them of the second displacement, first to Gaza and now to Egypt. They slowly rose from the ashes that were inflicted on them by the disposition of everything they had, and they slowly educated themselves. That's the weapon that Palestinians use. The main weapon of choice is education. Palestinians are the most highly educated people in the Middle East, in the region, at a rate of over 99%. And education is seen as an intrinsic part of resilience. It is the way to maintain your steadfastness. My late friend, the Gazan poet Rifat al-Arair, would always say, education is Israel's worst enemy. The more you educate, the more they're going to fight you, the more you're going to experience a backlash. Education is their worst enemy. So my dad became a doctor. My uncle, one of them became a nurse. The other one became a teacher. The last uncle studied at a military academy and became a police officer. Then Oslo came 1993, and that's around the time that I was born. I was born shortly after, and my family were asked to go to Gaza from Egypt, so that was the third displacement. Once my dad landed in Gaza, penniless and homeless, he started to build himself from scratch. So the first shelter that he had was with some distant relatives in a refugee camp in Gaza. And it is sort of like a surprise that since 1948 until 1993, refugee camps continued to exist. That is a testament to what the Jewish leading economist at Harvard University, Sarah Roy, termed as the de-development of Gaza, turning Gaza back to the Stone Age. So he went to live with some family members in a refugee camp called the Shati refugee camp, and he put one penny on top of another until he managed to put a deposit for an apartment, a very small apartment, where he slept on the floor for almost a year until he afforded to put money enough to buy some furniture. We moved to Egypt after him, a year after he moved there. And my first memory in Gaza was basically an airstrike. That is the earliest memory that I can remember. It's, I think, from the late 90s or the year 2000. I couldn't tell for sure. I was a small kid at the time, and it was an airstrike by an Apache helicopter, an American helicopter, on a newspaper in our neighborhood. My parents tried to conceal this whole conflict from us as much as possible to allow us to live with the illusion of normalcy. They didn't want us to grow up feeling inferior, looked down upon, oppressed, victimized. They wanted us to have a normal life. So they told me that this was thunder. The next morning, I went on the street, and it was unmistakable to see the burning printing machines, floppy disks, and papers all over the street. My second memory in Gaza is really checkpoints. And the reason for this is after my father was sent back to Gaza in 1993, 94, he very much feared that Israel would kick us out again to Egypt or beyond. Since they displaced him to Gaza and then to Egypt, he thought it's going to happen again. Now in 2026, I can only tell my late father that he was completely right about that fear, that my family has been displaced for the fourth time to Egypt once more. So that memory of the checkpoints comes from traveling every year back and forth to Egypt, or at least trying. It didn't always work. And that trip was for one purpose, to renew residence permit status so that we would have an entry way into Egypt if Israel kicks us out again. So that educated me politically at a very young age. So I was at the time, my earliest memories would be at my age of 4 or 5 years old. And I remember those Israeli soldiers sort of buffed out, giant muscles, big sunglasses, and a giant rifle pointed at me as a kid. And the rifle came with all sorts of curses and cusses in Arabic. And they would always yell the same phrase, Irja liwara. And Irja liwara means move back, as they herd us into pens. It's like feeding pens for cattle. That was the way out of Gaza. You would have to go through those pens being shoved from behind and the soldiers telling you to move back, and you're squeezed in the middle of that stampede, and people are climbing on both sides of the pins to make it through. Gaza was cut in two pieces by a giant checkpoint called Abu Holi. Abu Holi was a checkpoint that was administered by one soldier, a sharpshooter positioned on a watchtower, and that sharpshooter was authorized to shoot to kill anyone that tries to cross that checkpoint on foot. So all of us had to cram into cars and wait in a car in the smoldering heat of the desert for hours for that soldiers to allow us through. Sometimes he would allow us through that checkpoint from one side of Gaza to another. This is all inside Gaza. It would take sometimes 2 hours. Other times it would take 6 hours. Sometimes it would take days. And in that time, you're not allowed to walk on foot past that checkpoint. Even cattle, even donkeys were not allowed to pass by. So there were all those funny memories that I have of trucks or taxis with the donkeys shoved into the back seat as a way of crossing that checkpoint. At the Rafah crossing, it was Gaza's only gateway to the world back then with Egypt, but controlled by Israel. And the way that the crossing functioned is Israel would open it a few days a month. And every time it's open, there would be a stampede of people trying to get in or trying to get out. And then Israel would arbitrarily admit some and turn some back. At some point, my older brother had turned 16. So at the Rafah border crossing, a soldier arbitrarily decided he should be sent back to Gaza. We should be allowed into Egypt. And that's the end of the story. And once we were in Egypt, we were stuck there for, I think, about a month or two without being able to go back to Gaza until Israel opened that border again. So it was an absolute system of domination and control. My third earliest memory in life would be that of my UNRWA school. That is the school that educated my father, the United Nations Agency for Work and Relief for Palestinian Refugees. That is the school that helped my father to emerge out of the refugee camp, a successful doctor, a successful pediatrician, and it did the same to me. My English language skills that I'm using at the moment in this conversation are all taught to me in my UNRWA school. I never traveled to beyond the Middle East in my childhood. I never had any English special education. It's sort of all of it was learned at that kind of schooling system. It was very solid, very rigorous. And of course, it was strengthened significantly with Eric's help after we became friends, with a lot of practice, a lot of back and forth, a lot of advice on my use of language. So that memory of the UNRWA schools is particular because every kid in that school on the first day would ask, which village are you from? And the question is not meant which part of Gaza are you from? It is meant to ask which village did your parents live in before Israel kicked them out, or your grandparents. Each single kid in that school was a refugee or a descendant of a refugee. 80% of Gaza's population, about 2/3 or more, are refugees. They're not native to Gaza itself. It's people that were uprooted from 400 villages that Israel decimated completely, leaving no trace behind whatsoever when they kicked us out in 48. And I would say the fourth memory are frequent demonstrations all throughout Gaza back then, and those demonstrations being met by extraordinary violence. So at my UNRWA schools, I would have classmates who would come to me and say that they were shot by a rubber bullet a few days ago, and that's why they were absent. And they would show the marks of the rubber bullets, and they would show it with some sort of pride mixed with pain, anguish, and trauma. They would show it, kids back then, they would show it to say, look, we marched for our freedom. And I'm talking here not about teenagers. I was in elementary school. So I was below, I think it was in second or third grade. And that was the memory that I had of my classmates in school being shot by rubber bullets by Israeli soldiers. Back then, there was what was so-called the Second Intifada. It is often remembered for bus bombings and violent attacks on Israel, although the overwhelming majority of the casualties were on the Palestinian side. The Israeli columnist Gideon Levy wrote an article about the Second Intifada and how in the first days of that Intifada, when it was an overwhelmingly non-violent uprising, Israel shot over 1.3 million bullets at demonstrators before it descended into chaos and violence. So fast forward to 2005, that's when Israel decides to pull out of Gaza unilaterally. At least that is the pretext, that is the alibi, or that is the Israeli official claim that they left Gaza in 2005. And I remember those days vividly as well. I think there is an element of trauma sharpening your memory when you live in Gaza. So basically, back then, the way it unfolded is that in 2004, there was a debate in the Israeli government about Palestinians becoming more savvy, more politically experienced, and more articulate diplomatically. There was a deputy prime minister back then called Ehud Olmert. He made this verbatim statement, and I memorized it by heart. I'm now talking to you off the top of my mind. I don't have any prepared remarks, so as they say, I'm spitballing. And Olmert said, the Palestinians are moving from the Algerian model to the South African model. And the South African model, which is one man, one vote, equal rights, is, quote, a much cleaner struggle, a much more internationally respected struggle. And that struggle would be much more difficult to delegitimize and discredit. And his recommendation was to prevent, to thwart that Palestinian plan of moving to demand basic equality and basic human rights. We need to withdraw out of Gaza. Ariel Sharon was the prime minister at the time, and his chief advisor was a man called Dov Westglass. He went on the newspaper Haaretz, the Israeli oldest newspaper of record, and he gave this verbatim quote. He said, "We are withdrawing from Gaza to freeze the peace process, to prevent Palestinian statehood. when we leave Gaza, we will give them basically an impossible challenge. Turn Gaza into a Singapore, maintain Israel's absolute security from there, and then we shift the burden of proof on Palestinians in Gaza. There was a third politician at the time, I believe it was Benjamin Netanyahu. He was part of the Ariel Sharon coalition before he defected. And back then, his statements were to the extent that withdrawing from Gaza would make it much easier to bomb it, because Israel had about 10,000 settlers or 7,000 settlers in Gaza, which made it difficult to carpet bomb the place or starve the people there. But if you take those settlers out, you can do whatever you want to the entire population that is left behind. Cage them, torment them, besiege them, etc. And that is precisely what Israel did. So Israel left Gaza nominally. They took 7,000 settlers out, and in return, they sent hundreds of thousands of settlers into the West Bank immediately. And over the years that followed, Israel back then took the troops, the soldiers out of Gaza, but deployed them around Gaza and declared a de facto siege. It was not official back then, but back then the army, the Israeli army, continued to control Gaza's water space, airspace, and land space under immense restrictions. So in 2005, there was an agreement called the Agreement on Movement, and it is an agreement between the Palestinian Authority, Egypt, and Israel on governing the movement of Palestinians in and out of Gaza. So I will just mention briefly a couple of the details, and I will leave it to your judgment. Does it sound like Israel left Gaza or not? That agreement dictated that there should be videotape cameras in that Egyptian crossing and in the Palestinian part of the crossing, where Israeli soldiers would watch everything remotely. Each Palestinian passport, before it is admitted into Gaza, before the person holding that passport is admitted in and out, should be scanned and sent to Israel for approval. Each person that wanted to go in and out of Gaza should petition Israel at least 48 hours in advance through the Palestinian Authority, and Israel would have the right to say, yes, you are allowed to go in or out, or they have the right to punish them and say you're not allowed. All of this is from the Egyptian borders, not Israeli borders. And at that stage, not controlled by Israel on paper. Israel would withhold the right to prevent any internationals from going into Gaza through the Egyptian borders. Anyone that wants to go into Gaza, solidarity groups, journalists, etc., they need to petition Israeli authorities, and Israel will decide to reject the overwhelming majority of them de facto. So that was the withdrawal of Gaza. The population registry, which means, do I have the right to be a Palestinian, remained in Israel's hand after the withdrawal. So a cousin of mine was returning to Gaza, I think in the early 2000s. And when she came back to Gaza, married a Palestinian there, she's a Palestinian herself, but her mother and herself grew up out of Gaza in Egypt when they were exiled and did not return with Oslo. She returned to Gaza. Israel refused to register her in the population registry, which meant de facto that she was caged in there. She was not allowed to have a Palestinian passport or a Palestinian ID because Israel decided you're not in the population registry. So that is leaving Gaza. The other thing is that when Israel, quote unquote, left, they cut off Gaza's labor force that was working inside Israel or in the West Bank immediately. So you had about 100,000 people that overnight became unemployed, leading to what the leading economist at Harvard University, Sarah Roy, at the time described as the worst economic depression in modern history. That was the withdrawal. The withdrawal, the last aspect of it, was unilateral. So unilateral means Israel did it on its own. It was not part of the peace process, which meant the only group that can claim credit for it was the armed resistance, was Hamas and other armed groups in Gaza that the US lists as terrorists. So Hamas immediately put signboards all over Gaza that said a simple message: negotiations, the peace process failed. It led nowhere. Armed resistance liberated Gaza. That was the simple statement back then. A year after, the United States forces the Palestinian Authority to hold elections, and those elections, they force in it Hamas to participate. Hamas was reluctant. The United States, the Bush administration, went to Qatar and Turkey to compel Hamas to take part in those. with an explicit promise that if they win, the US would respect the election results. The elections happened, and because of the unilateral withdrawal, because of the worst economic depression in modern history that Israel unleashed on Gaza, you had about 47%, so it's not even a majority, 47%, less than 50% of people in Gaza or in Palestine in general voted for Hamas as an angry vote against a dysfunctional Palestinian Authority and against an unlivable status quo. So the immediate reaction by Israel and the Bush administration was to sanction the Palestinian Authority immediately, cut off all funding, and put Gaza on an immediate blockade, a tool of what Israel would call as economic warfare. The idea behind it is simple. The rationale is people in Gaza should be starved to the extent that life becomes impossible, but we will not allow them to die. We will just keep them on the brink until they rise up against Hamas and topple the Hamas government. What followed is basically an episode of short-lived Palestinian civil war between Fatah and Hamas that ended up with Hamas controlling Gaza. Life since then was absolute siege. So the blockade on Cuba has lasted far longer than the blockade on Gaza, but it is very trivial in comparison. Cuba still has its water passages and its airway to use for Cubans to travel in and out, for internationals to go in and out. In Gaza, Israel prohibited anything from going in and out except for what it deemed an absolute humanitarian necessity, which meant that pasta was banned, hummus was banned, chocolates, baby chicks, diapers, coriander, spices, coffee, tea, all of it was banned because it was not humanitarian. So it was what Israel called a starvation plus diet. And it is particularly in that moment that my father fell ill and began to die before my eyes, and we couldn't do anything about it. The medical system in Gaza had collapsed. Food is running out. And I remember vividly one of my father's last wishes, one of his dying wishes, was to get some figs to comfort himself in his dying moments, to remember the village that he came from, the tree that he planted as a child, the tree that they planted in Egypt, the tree they planted in the refugee camp, and he wanted to remember it. And he sent me out to buy figs for him in the evening. And I went one shop to the other, endlessly, one after the other, after the other, after the other. I even walked into pharmacies to ask if they had dried figs, because they usually used to have them before the siege. And I couldn't find anything. I couldn't even find any basic fruit. So I didn't sort of bear the guilt of going back and looking in his eyes and saying I couldn't find anything. So I waited downstairs until I knew, okay, now it's late enough, he's probably sleeping, and I snuck into my bed. When I learned that he was dying, basically his dying moments is him slowly withering and dying before our eyes, day after day after day. And the only thing you can give him is painkillers, nothing more. And I remember back then I was a child, I would go into my room and I would pray to God endlessly. Please, God, let it be me and not him. Take me, just not him. I have other siblings, I have a mother, we have a family. Take me instead of him. And that was my memory as a child. After he died, I was completely devastated and my world was collapsing. But before I even got to process that grief, Israel started to bomb Gaza left and right. That was known as Operation Cast Lead. It was a few months after he died. And I remember the first day of that operation was Israel bombing many dozen locations all throughout Gaza. So I was being dropped at my school, and as soon as I arrived to the school, the bombs were dropped simultaneously. And I remember being rushed into a bus again and taking us home. And on the way back, there is body parts, there is debris, there is rubble everywhere. And there is these clouds, the dark clouds of explosions all around. And that was Operation Cast Lead, in which Israel, the main goal of the operation, according to the United Nations. So the United Nations commissioned a report by a Jewish Zionist South African judge called Richard Goldstone. He came to Gaza and he said, my first fear is that when I walk into Gaza as a Jew, I would be killed. And then he was shocked by the warm embrace he got from people there. And he followed his conscience, and he wrote a report in which the conclusion is the main goal of Israel's Operation Cast Lead was to, quote, punish, humiliate, and terrorize people in Gaza, the civilian population in Gaza. And before processing any of this, I remember in one of the days in that war, the Israeli tanks invaded our neighborhood. I could hear the roaring sounds of heavy machinery approaching, and I didn't know what it is. I thought it was a truck. And suddenly a machine gun went off and it never stopped. And it was coupled with white phosphorus, which is a chemical material that burns and ignites upon immediate contact with air, with oxygen. And it was shot all around in the late evening. So my siblings and I and my mother, my youngest brother back then was barely a year old. He was even younger than a year old when my father had passed away. And we just scrambled and ran into the basement of the building where we lived. And the basement was also a garage where it had multiple vehicles. My father's car was one of them. So we just hid in that car with the smoke, the thick smoke of white phosphorus crawling through the windows late at night with the tanks approaching, the machine guns never stopping. And I remember my mom's only advice was, keep your hand on your brother's mouth. If he cries, he's gonna give up our location. And us just having to sit still in that car. And my mother's only desperate trick to keep us composed was to put some water on pieces of cloth and say, cover your face with it. This will protect you. And just staying there all night. So that was Operation Cast Lead. Before I got to process any of this, there were many operations that followed. Pillars of Defense, Guardian of the Wall, Crack of Dawn, Protective Edge, etc. They just followed, and it became a regular routine that Israel would refer to as mowing the lawn, mowing the grass. And the grass blades, half of Gaza's population are children below 18 years old. So mowing the lawn, cutting off the heads that rise above. There was an Israeli general called Giora Island that was asked recently about Israel's systematic killing of children in Gaza. His answer was very cold-hearted. He said something to the extent of, what can you do? Gazans have a lot of children. They breed a lot. They keep making children. That was basically his excuse. Then October 7th happened, and the genocide that was unleashed right after. It was completely different from everything that I've witnessed in my entire life. So in my time in Gaza, I survived 3 wars and 10 military operations. Yet none of them, all of them combined, would not amount to 1% of the atrocities that were unleashed on my people there. So with the last 2.5 years, the details, it's superfluous for me to go into the record. It's super well documented. And the most documented element of it are the atrocities that Israeli soldiers themselves documented, photographed, shot videos of, and then posted on social media as a badge of honor and pride. There was even an article in the newspaper Haaretz, the oldest Israeli newspaper, that talked about dating culture in Israel becoming strange, where Israeli soldiers would experience more intimacy, more intimate encounters, more women approaching them if they were to post pictures of themselves committing atrocities in Gaza, or if they were to post pictures of themselves with the lingerie of presumably dead families in Gaza. There was one incident in which a soldier said that he didn't have much luck with women before the genocide, and that after he put on a military uniform, went into Gaza, documented it, posted it, he couldn't get enough of women approaching him. So he had to take a sick leave from the army because of how many dates he got. The situation in Gaza now, after the last 2.5 years, there is 3 levels of life in the enclave at the moment. The top level are the people. So this is the luckiest people that I know, is my friend Anas. Anas is living in a 7-story residential building, a condominium, on the first floor. That building was bombed. The last 2 floors of it were bombed completely. The ground floor was shelled by Israeli tanks. The building has a giant hole going all through it from a 2,000-pound Israeli bomb that did not explode. It went through the apartment where Anas lives and it landed on the ground floor. So it's right underneath him. So in his living room, there is a giant hole in the ceiling and in the floor where you can look down and see the bomb waiting underneath you, ready to explode by any mistake at any moment. The apartment itself, it doesn't have any doors or windows. And every wall in it either fully collapsed or partially collapsed. There is no running water. There is no electricity. There is no functioning bathrooms. There's nothing, absolutely nothing. There is no heating. There's no, as I said, no windows, no doors. The entire building is riddled with bullets. And Anas's routine is that he sleeps at night with one eye open to prevent mice, rats, and other rodents from attacking his daughter, his 4-year-old daughter that was born shortly before the start of the genocide. And Anas's daughter is basically the love of his life. He's trying to give her a sense of normalcy as much as possible. So his daytime routine is him going every day from morning until sunset to look for water or food. Every day with very sporadic, very scarce luck. It works one day a week, one day every other week, where he finds food, one day where he finds water, one day where he finds water for drinking, another day water for cleaning, etc. And it is this cursed life that Anas has been left with. Although before the genocide, he was a dignified, successful humanitarian worker. He was a person of huge pride. And now whenever I call him, the first thing he does is cry and look down in shame at the situation that he lives in, that he cannot afford to provide to his family, to his daughter before his eyes. Even the water that Anas finds is contaminated. You have to sit in a long queue for multiple hours, and then you get 1 gallon of water back with you home. You carry it all the way home, and that water is dug from an aquifer, a water well that is polluted with raw sewage because Israel bombed Gaza's sewage lines, Gaza's water desalination facilities, Gaza's sewage treatment facilities systematically. So Anas is forced to watch himself poison his very own daughter to keep her alive. And that life is considered the luckiest. So Anas is at the very top. That's the luckiest person that I know because he has a roof on top of his head. Even if that roof has a giant hole in it, even if it might collapse at any moment, it's still a roof on top of his head. The second class of people in Gaza are people like my friend Ibrahim living in a tent. He was a brilliant computer engineer, a programmer. Before the genocide, he had customers from the US, from Europe, from the Arab Gulf, from Korea, Japan, all over the world. He was working remotely on freelancing platforms. And now he's living destitute and penniless in a tent on the street with his son Muhammad, who is the same age as Anas's daughter. The problem with living in a tent is that it gets regularly invaded by scorpions, snakes, cockroaches, mosquitoes, etc. And in the day, in the heat of the day, that tent becomes a baking oven because of it collects all the vapor, all the humidity, and all the concentrated heat. It channels it in, conserves it in, it turns into a baking oven. So you have to vacate it throughout the day. At night, when you go in, there is a buzzing noise on top of your head that keeps you awake all throughout the night. And that buzzing noise is Israeli Predator drones on top of your head 24/7. And the buzzing noise never ends. Zzz. And it's been on top of the heads of people in Gaza for the last 2 decades. It is the feature that I grew up with. There's even a famous Palestinian book called The Drone Eats With Me. The Drone Eats With Me, because of how constant of a feature it has become. Palestinian parents interviewed by mainstream media before October 7th, one of them said, "My child's first words were mom, dad, and drone," the Israeli Predator drones on top of their heads. Now there is another kind of drones. It's smaller, it's more dystopian. It's called a quadcopter drone. It roams free throughout the refugee camps. It even invades homes at nights and would shine flashlights at people. And each one of those drones, it's the size of your palm or a little bigger. Each one of them is equipped with a grenade or a shooting gun. And it is equipped to shoot to kill or detonate and explode. and it is known to have been used to target people at random with no pretext, nothing whatsoever. A few days ago, there was a Palestinian young man sitting at a cafe with his friends drinking some tea, and then one of those quadcopters was passing by and shot him in the back of his head, and he fell dead immediately on the spot. So that is the life of living in a tent. The next class are people that are literally living on the street, where they cannot even afford to buy a tent because a tent costs a couple $100. They cannot afford this, so they are literally sleeping on the street. Or if they are lucky enough, they are sleeping in overcrowded, abandoned schools. So those schools were run by the United Nations, then they were turned into makeshift shelters for displaced people. And in those schools, not my own testimony, but the testimony of American humanitarian workers that went into Gaza, doctors that went throughout the genocide, they said in one of the schools, there were 50,000 people. That school on a normal day would have about 500 students. Now it has 50,000 people in that school. And in that school, 50,000 people are sharing 4 toilets. There is no showers whatsoever. It's just 4 toilets for 50,000 people. And in that school, she encountered people with burning wounds that never healed and rotting flesh that was never treated. And they're just sitting and baking in the sun, starving and waiting for any scraps of food. And that is basically the life of the overwhelming majority of the population on the street or in overcrowded shelters. It begs the question, where do we go from here? To conclude briefly, there is the Trump plan that is known as the Board of Peace, the plan of prosperity for Gaza, and that plan on paper, it sounds atrociously criminal. There's no getting around it. I'm trying to be as diplomatic and polite as possible. I would leave the cursing for people in the room when the camera is turned off. But basically, I'll give you one simple example. So with that Board of Peace, it presented a map of what Gaza would look like after it's rebuilt and reconstructed. And the way Gaza looked is that it would be 8 cages, 8 reservations, like the ones that indigenous Americans were entrapped into. And those 8 reservations, 8 cages, each one of them is in the color brown, and each one is separated from the one next to it by a giant buffer zone planted with trees so that no homes would be allowed to be built there. But each one of those cages has in its backyard an industrial zone for a multinational corporation or an AI data center or a Tesla factory, where the population there would be basically cheap labor. So the conclusion that not Palestinians, the conclusion that Israeli media drew from this, the Israeli national television is called Channel 12. Israel's Channel 12 ran an article that said Jared Kushner is planning to turn Gaza into a tax haven for billionaires with cheap labor and no regulations. No laws, no protections, no regulations. People there are relegated to cheap labor, basically slaves in cantonized, caged prison cells in concentration camps, where their only option in life is to go and work at an AI data center, a mega factory, and a Tesla hub, etc. And that's the life they envision for people there. There is another example that I find the most hilarious and the most dystopian. So the other day I was talking to a journalist from The Guardian, and she mentioned to me, she asked, do you know the group Alligator Alcatraz? And I heard the name, like, Alcatraz is known as the most infamous prison in the US. Alligator and Alcatraz, like, is that an upgraded hell on earth? And then she said, guess what? They're getting a humanitarian contract to work in Gaza. And I was biking when I was talking to her. I fell off the bike and I almost stumbled the whole crowd of bikers behind me. I choked in that moment. Like, Alligator Alcatraz will be in charge of humanitarian aid to Gaza. And the way that they were promised that contract is corrupt to the teeth. They were promised a no-bidding contract, the same one that Trump gave to that friend of his about that reflecting pool that turned into a rotting swamp next to the White House. The same kind of process, a no-bidding contract for $1.7 billion. $1.7 billion, not a million. and they would give them profit margins of 300% to come and work in Gaza. But the best part is that the journalist told me the owner of Alligator Alcatraz explicitly told her that he was concerned about this, that it didn't feel right to him. He was concerned about bad PR, that working in Gaza with the name Alligator Alcatraz would give him a bad reputation. It's some insane sci-fi horror dystopia. So that is the plan that they have for Gaza at the moment. And this plan, this dystopia, is predicated on an explicit condition of surrender, that Palestinians should once and for all renounce any right to resistance against Israel. Why do you need resistance when the problem of Palestinians, the main problem for Palestinians, has been for all those years bad governance? And now we're going to get the good governance from Donald Trump, Jared Kushner, Peter Thiel, Larry Ellison, Mark Ruan, and all of those advisors and friends and networkers and connections to the Trump family and the MAGA world. They're going to solve all of it. We just had idiots before, and now the guy that looks like he's been on puberty blockers his entire life, the guy that looks like his face is made out of pure porcelain, and the guy that looks like the lead character in the movie Revenge of the Nerds is going to come into Gaza and solve all problems with a magic brush. That is the promise that they have with the help of Alligator Alcatraz. And even then, they put the condition in order for them to grace us with their majesty, with their amazing, generous help and expertise. Gaza needs to be fully disarmed, completely. Nothing should be left of it that could mount any form of resistance against Israel, none whatsoever. All weapons, including nail clippers, pocket knives, sticks, grenades, all of it should be given up immediately. And all of this before Israel leaves Gaza. Now the question is, Israel signed this ceasefire plan, the Trump plan, the amazing, most luxurious, most amazing plan made by the naked emperor, who we need to admire his nakedness all the time and his majestic bowls. So this plan was crafted and signed in October 2025. Israel had a number of obligations to fulfill in the first half of the plan. It was cut into two halves. One of them was to allow 600 trucks of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Another one was to stop bombing Gaza, cease all military operations. A third one was to allow for the removal of rubble and the restoration of electricity, water, medical services, sanitation, sewage, etc. Another one was the opening of Gaza's Rafah border crossing with Egypt to allow people to go in and out. Israel never fulfilled a single one of those. They killed over 1,000 people since the ceasefire started. They have been allowing on average 94 trucks of humanitarian aid per day, according to the United Nations. 94 out of 600. 600 is the bare minimum that the United Nations itself put as the bare minimum needed to revert the famine that Israel had created in Gaza. So they are allowing less than 20% of this, less than a fifth of the bare minimum. And Rafah remains heavily restricted, and none of it was fulfilled. So the question is, if Israel never fulfilled the first half of its ceasefire in Gaza, why should any person with an IQ above room temperature trust that Israel would fulfill the second half of the deal once Gaza becomes completely defenseless, completely toothless, without any form of resistance, without any ability to fight back, where people are fully disarmed, down to nail clippers, pepper sprays, and Swiss Army knives? That is the plan that they have. The alternative to this plan, there's a number of alternatives. We keep hearing from people like Hillary Clinton. She wrote an article in the Financial Times where she says, I was the biggest critic of Donald Trump, but his plan for Gaza is the only one, and you should trust it and you should follow it. It's insane. It sounds like marching orders from the Israeli lobby in Washington. They just sent a communique out there. You need to blindly endorse and worship this plan, and everyone has to repeat. And the problem that she repeats there is the argument that You have to support this plan because it's the only plan in town. It's the only one. There's no other plan whatsoever. There is a number of plans. One of them is called the Egyptian plan or the Arab plan that was endorsed by every Arab and Muslim country on the face of the earth. And the plan is simple: full cessation of hostilities between Israel and Hamas and other factions, immediate rebel removal and reconstruction. And this cessation of hostility would last for, let's say, 5 years, a decade, as long as Israel needs to build trust in its own society with its own population towards the idea of the two-state solution. So that's one plan. Israel rejected it immediately out of hand. There is another plan called the Northern Ireland
I'm sorry to
plan.
interrupt you. Can you hold on for a second? We're having technical difficulties in the room.
Sure.
Sorry about that.
I'm also happy to conclude here and save the rest for the questions and answers.
No, we just got everything back. Please feel free to continue.
Perfect. The problem is that when I'm very tired and drained and craving any kind of coffee whatsoever without any access to none, my brain goes into this phase of cognitive decline and my mouth starts rambling nonstop. So I will just keep pouring out information. Like the last 2.5 years gave me this informational overload. And I've been talking for the last hour without any notes or prepared remarks. And I'm happy to keep doing it extemporaneously for the next 2 hours, unless Eric steps in and stops me. But basically, the last plan that I would conclude with is called the Northern Ireland plan. And the plan that was established already in Ireland to end the bloody conflict there was called the Good Friday Agreement. And the Good Friday Agreement was simple. It said, okay, there is no place for violence in society. There is no place for unregulated militias, unregulated armed groups, etc. So we need to get rid of those. At the same time, there is no place in society for a foreign belligerent occupying power, the British police, British troops. So the plan goes as this. We begin with full cessation of hostilities. All weapons should be locked up in warehouses, in depots. There would be a strict policy of no display, no use, and no production of weapons. And this would last for the next decade. And in that decade, we would implement a peace agreement. And once the peace agreement is fully implemented, the weapons would be destroyed because there is no longer a need for those whatsoever. So that's the premise of the plan. It's simple, it's practical, it worked there. Now in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, and the United Kingdom, Britain, as well as Norway and Ireland, are all supportive of this plan. Even Hamas had accepted the premise of this plan. They said if the occupation is over, if we get a two-state solution, there is no need for rockets or RPGs. Rockets is a misnomer. It's basically firecrackers. It's projectiles manufactured in Gaza, homemade projectiles. Norman Finkelstein would always say it's firecrackers. But basically they said we would abandon the rockets, we would abandon the tunnels, we would abandon any sort of armed resistance if there is no need for armed resistance anymore. And before then, there would be full cessation of hostilities for the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, as much as Israel needs to convince its people to accept peace. If this sounds unreasonable, I'm not sure what else would work. This is the most compromising it gets. And even then, Israel immediately rejected it out of hand. So thank you so much. I will conclude here.
So Mohammed, you're getting a lot of applause, and it's well deserved. And again, we thank you. I have some questions here in the chat. I have a couple on cards. I'm gonna reserve the right to ask you the first one though. And it's kind of a two-parter that you can combine. You once told me a long time ago that the people in Gaza, the Palestinians in Gaza, felt luckier than the Palestinians on in the occupied West Bank, because, and this was a long time ago, because the people in Gaza always knew that the bombs would stop, but the humiliation of the Palestinians in the occupied West Bank never stops. First part of the question is, do you still feel that way? Secondly, what was your first thought when you learned of what happened on October 7th? He's not, we can't hear him. Mohammed, you're muted. We heard none of it.
Thanks so much for the question. It's a really very thorough one and a very thoughtful one. So the way that apartheid works is that it is stratified. There's multiple levels and layers to it. Each one is unfortunate in its own way. So it's hard to judge which is worse, Gaza or the West Bank. So for example, Palestinians in East Jerusalem are stateless. They're not allowed to be Palestinian citizens. They're not allowed to be Israeli citizens. They have permanent Israeli residence permits, so like a green card, but they're not allowed citizenship. And they're discriminated against in every way possible. They have to pay taxes to the Israeli authorities that would come and kick them out of their homes. So they pay the salaries of the municipality workers and the Israeli police officers that would go and destroy their homes and kick them out and shoot their children and prevent them from praying at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, etc. So this is one layer. The second layer is Palestinians in the diaspora who are also discriminated against in every way possible. They're not even allowed to see Palestine or Israel or any part of it. None, zero. They're not allowed into Gaza or the West Bank. Many of them lived and died without ever stepping a foot there because they're not in the Israeli population registry that decides who's Palestinian and who's not. And then you have Palestinian Israeli citizens who are living in this nightmare dystopia. After October 7th, Israel went and kidnapped a lot of Palestinian Israeli citizens for simple social media posts. One of them wrote a Facebook post that said good morning on October 7th. And he said afterwards that he had no idea about the Hamas attack that was unleashed in that moment. So Israel went and immediately kidnapped him. And they immediately put him in detention. And they immediately put him on trial. There's another case of a woman writing Alhamdulillah, which means thank God. She was immediately arrested, humiliated as well. I met a lot of Israeli Palestinian citizens, as well as Israeli left-wing activists, pro-Palestinian activists, who would tell me about this horror dystopia of life where you feel watched in your every breath, every move. And if you say one word wrong, you would end up being kidnapped and humiliated immediately. The comparison between Gaza and the West Bank, up until October 7th, my personal evaluation is that it was much worse in the West Bank in terms of the humiliation. Gaza, you had all sorts of curses. Gazans were caged in a permanent state of non-life. So you would reach, I had family and friends who were reaching the age of 37 without ever having been able to get a job, move out of their childhood bedroom, move out of their parents' homes, afford to start a family, fall in love, put food on the table, have purpose in life. Their entire being was reduced to shame. Every time either one of them would go out of his room and ask for pocket money from his parents to go and buy breakfast, they would do so with their heads bowed down in shame. Some of my friends in Gaza, their worst day possible was basically their birthday, because it reminded them that their lives were languishing before their eyes before they ever got a chance to live it. So it was dystopian in every sense of the word. In the West Bank at the same time, they had a few more economic opportunities. They have been on decline in recent years, so they sort of almost evaporated completely after October 7th. Now people there are feeling both the besiegement, beleaguerment, impoverishment, and the humiliation. But it is a situation, Eric, where imagine this. You're a Palestinian living in Hebron. One day, an Israeli settler called Amiram bin Aluel decides to march into your village with Molotov cocktails and throw it through your bedroom window. And the next thought, the next thing you know, is that you are watching your entire family burning before your eyes, and you can't do anything about it. This is literally what this Israeli settler Amiram bin Aluel went and did to a Palestinian family and killed the entire family, 2 parents and a baby. Only 1 kid survived, Muhammad Dawabsha, and that was in 2015, so 8 years before October 7th. And for that settler, Amiram bin Aluel, you saw him burning your family alive, and then he ended up in jail because it became a high-profile case. But the next thing you know is that all of his friends are now coming in front of your home to sing and dance. Your baby is burning on the grill. Ali is burning on the grill over and over and over again. And the next thing you know is that the lawyer that defended this settler that burned your family alive is now the Israeli minister of the police, the Israeli minister of the security, Itamar Ben-Gvir. And that minister was an attendant at a wedding where Israeli settlers were singing again with a picture of that baby. They had the picture of Ali printed out. They made the effort. They went through this to print a picture of him, and they stabbed it with knives, and they danced around it with Kalashnikov rifles and with Molotov cocktails, and they danced and sang, "Avenge me, avenge me, Ali is on the grill." So those settlers are now your neighbors and the landlords, and they can walk into your village any time of the day, any day of the week, burn your home again, burn any vehicles on their way, and not get touched. So Amiram bin Aluel, that settler that did it in 2015, was the exception to the rule. He landed in prison. Many of his friends murdered Palestinians after and are just on the loose. One of them is an Israeli settler, one of the people that stood and danced and said Amiram, that said Ali on the grill, Ali on the grill, is an Israeli settler called Elisha Yerid. And Elisha Yerid was detained by the Israeli police briefly and then put under house arrest for the suspicion of killing a Palestinian farmer. Settlers went into the village. The farmer came out to look at what's happening. They shot him in the head. The Israeli police apprehended 2 settlers. One of them is Elisha Yerid. Both settlers were let free. Elisha Yerid is now the spokesperson of one of the governing parties in the Israeli government. His boss is the deputy head of the Israeli parliament, the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli Congress. She is called Limor Sonhar Melech. She fundraised $120,000 for Amiram bin Aluel, again, the settler that burned down a baby. She raised $120,000 for him to give to him and his family and improve his situation in prison. And she went and visited him in prison. And then she came out and said in a video, she said, Amiram is holy. I was shaking in his presence. When I was in front of him, I was hiding behind the soldiers, the guards. I was shaking because of him radiating with light. He is holy. She's referring to the settler that burned alive a Palestinian baby. I'm sorry I sound like a broken record, but all of this sounds insane to me. And those are your neighbors, your landlords, and the government that is ruling over you. And they made the decision recently that if an Israeli settler kills a Palestinian, most likely they will walk free. If a Palestinian kills an Israeli settler, even in self-defense, they would be immediately sentenced to death and executed within 90 days, 90 days, unappealable, in a military tribunal. They would be marched in front of a military court. So this is life in the West Bank. So in the West Bank, there is a case that a human rights activist documented. A woman was detained by Israeli soldiers. They raped her in prison. They tortured her as well. She came out. She told her husband and her family that she was raped and tortured. The only thing that her husband can do is to go to the police station and file a report, an Israeli police station, and file a report against the Israeli police officer that is taking his report that you raped my wife. And then look in the face of those soldiers and officers laughing at him in his face as he files this report. He goes home and he decides to speak up. So he calls journalists and human rights organizations to report what happened to his wife. The next thing, he and his wife, they get a phone call from the Israeli military commander in their area telling them, shut up, or we will take her again and rape her again. That's the life there. That's life in the West Bank. Not even the Wild West would describe this. Even in the Wild West, you had some moral code. It is like kill or be killed. It was atrocious. There were all sorts of savage and barbaric atrocities against indigenous Americans. So it's not even a place for comparison. But words fall short of explaining or describing what kind of life this is. I don't even think the Wild West suffices, especially by a country that describes itself to be the only democracy in the Middle East, or soon enough the only democracy in the galaxy, with the most moral army on the face of the earth. So not even Luxembourg or Liechtenstein or Austria or Switzerland have a more moral army. No, Israel has the most moral army in the world. Before the Canadians, the Luxembourgians, the Swiss, the Swedes, the Danes, the Norwegians, Israel is more peaceful. The other question about October 7th. When it unfolded, I remember waking up in that morning, seeing a headline, and the headline was Hamas invades Israel. Hamas is in Sderot. Sderot is an Israeli town close to Gaza that was built on top of a Palestinian village called Houj. Houj is a very specific and special Palestinian village. The reason it's special, it's because the tribal leader, the elder of Houj, was sheltering a lot of Haganah members. So those are the Zionist pre-Israel militias. He was hiding and sheltering them, providing them with refuge and food, and hiding them from the British. After Israel was established, 1948, the first decision that Ben Gurion took against Houj is depopulate it completely, kick everybody out, leave nothing behind. So they pleaded with him, the people of Houj, we gave you sanctuary, we gave you shelter, we protected you, we lived side by side, at least let us live here or take us somewhere else. And Ben Gurion decides to put them on trucks at gunpoint and send them to a refugee camp in Gaza. So that's the first connotation that I got. I couldn't believe that it was happening. My brain was rushing with different thoughts in that moment. The immediate thought is Israel is going to annihilate Gaza. Before we have experience with multiple rounds before, Hamas would fire a single firecracker in Israel. Israel would destroy entire neighborhoods. This time around, Hamas is inside Israel. And all of this is in the first hour. Back then, we didn't know how many Israelis were killed at all. So I decided to pick up the phone and call my friends in Gaza and my family. And I tried multiple people. The only person that I got through to immediately was my close friend Ali. He was killed a year later at a hospital in Gaza. Israel bombed the hospital and he was killed immediately. And Ali, when I called him, his first thought was, Israel is going to wipe us out. And he immediately said, I need to go to a bakery because Israel will cut food and water to Gaza. So I need to queue in line and store as much bread and wheat flour as possible. So he hung up and ran away to get some bread. These were the first thoughts that occurred to the minds of Gazans. As the scene began to unfold, I got a call from another friend, and he saw the footage of the Bibas children. This was the Bibas family that were taken captive in Ner Oz, a kibbutz near Gaza. And it was the mother, the father, and the two kids. Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, or the war minister more appropriately, he gave a long podcast interview with an American interviewer, American media. And he said in that interview that the Bibas parents, I forgot the name of I think Jacob and Sherry. So basically, he said that both of the parents took out a gun and went out to push back against the Hamas invasion of that kibbutz. So both of them, according to Yoav Galant, went out and engaged in combat against Hamas militants. And then they ended up being captured with their children. And there's a footage of them at the borders of Gaza. And I remember talking to a friend, and his first thought is, I felt a great deal of sorrow for this family because of the children. And he immediately said that he wished if he was there to secure them, to protect them and send them back. So this was one friend that I talked to back then. Another friend, his entire family were killed by Israel. Every single member of his family were killed in a single strike, except for one sister. So his parents, his sisters, his brothers, his nieces, his nephews, every single one of them was exterminated. And I called him and I asked, I was supposed to write an article. It didn't get published, but the article was about how people look at October 7th, Palestinians from Gaza. And his immediate reaction is, I am fully against the killing of Israeli civilians. There is this clear, vivid moral compass. And it is something that Edward Said was asked about once. Edward Said being a famous Palestinian-American scholar, intellectual, an activist, a giant of his time. And he was asked about the killing of civilians. And he said, this is terrorism. This is wanton murder. And then he said, you know who introduced it to this area? Who were the first to introduce the bus bombings, the market bombings, the hotel bombings? It was the Zionist militias, Ergan, Lehi, Haganah, etc. They were the ones that introduced terrorism. There's even an article by an Israeli Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, in which he says terrorism is an acceptable method of warfare for Jews, but not for Arabs, explicitly, without a second thought. I would say the most nuanced article that I read on October 7th is an article by Adam Schatz in the London Review of Books. It was brilliant. The article I think is about 6,500 words. It's pretty long, but it is very complex and it captures a lot of nuance. And in that article, Adam Schatz is looking at Fanon, and he's saying that Fanon, in his thinking about the wretched of the earth, he theorized that the oppressed is a person who's always dreaming of becoming the oppressor, or doing to the oppressor what the oppressor has done to him. This is true to some victims in Gaza, but as I said, the people that I know explicitly told me that they rejected any killing of civilians whatsoever. They rejected this logic of an eye for an eye. There's the last comment that I would add to this is one that I got from an Israeli friend, a very decent activist, pro-Palestinian, and he said, Marxists, Karl Marx, theorized that revolutions led by the bourgeoisie would always be mostly nonviolent, not as bloody, less atrocious, whereas revolutions led by the peasants, peasant uprisings, would always be bloody, would always be brutal, would always be violent. And his theory is that Israel spent 3 decades or more in the time of the siege, the time of the bombing, the time of invading Gaza, de-developing, destroying Gaza, impoverishing its people, and turning them into peasants. So basically, it ended up with a peasant revolution. This was the same conclusion that Amira Haas, a journalist in Haaretz, a very veteran Israeli journalist, said about October 7th. She said, quote, I verified, I was there, atrocities were committed. Atrocities were committed on October 7th. That's her verbatim quote. But she said, what this tells me is that the pressure on Gaza must have been so monstrous to enable such monstrous acts. And it is consistent with, if you follow Norman Finkelstein, he spoke repeatedly about the slave rebellions in the US. There were multiple slave rebellions in Haiti, in Puerto Rico, in the US, etc. And the most remembered, the most famous is the one by Nat Turner, where Nat Turner's orders was kill all whites. And they went and they actually did. They did the smashing of the skulls of babies, the beheading of babies, and the killing of babies in crypts. And back then, Norman says he went and read the newspapers of the abolitionists, the most famous of which was The Liberator. And he said the abolitionists repeatedly said, "We told you so, we told you so, we told you so," keeping people in shackles, keeping people in slavery, keeping people in oppressed will inevitably blow up in your face. So Norman said, you would condemn the deed, you would condemn atrocities that were committed, but you would not condemn Palestinians. That was his logic based on the uprisings of the slave rebellions.
Okay, Mohammed, I got a couple of questions here, and I'm trying to keep them kind of thematic. And we have a chat question that is, how well positioned is Egypt to quietly undermine some of Israel's oppression of Gaza? And I am going to combine that with the ones who want to know more about the Egyptian plan and your thoughts on the Egyptian plan.
Absolutely. So in terms of Egypt, I have a small short anecdote so that we would be able to take more questions. I suffer from the same syndrome as Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln used to say something like, I can write short sermons, but once I start, I find it impossible to finish and find it difficult to know where to stop. So basically, in terms of the Egyptian pressure on Israel, Egypt did resist a huge, a tremendous, and unprecedented amount of pressure that was exerted on it by Israel and the Biden administration to ethnically cleanse Gaza. So immediately after October 7th, Blinken went on a tour to multiple Middle Eastern countries. And he asked them, reportedly, he asked them explicitly to allow Israel to kick everyone from Gaza into the Sinai desert so that Israel would go in, finish the job, and then maybe Israel would let us back in Gaza again, or maybe not. We have a lot of experience. Anything that Israel says is temporary means permanent. Temporary in Hebrew means permanent in English. So basically, this is one way in which Egypt resisted. Another way was the Egyptian chief of intelligence, right after October 7th, called a senior official from the Biden administration. And this is the senior official himself telling that story, according to a journalist, a friend of mine that told me this. And the Biden official is saying, the Egyptian chief of intelligence called me and said, please restrain the Israelis. Please pressure Netanyahu. Tell him not to go on a rampage in Gaza. Tell him not to destroy everything. Tell him not to go insane. Tell him not to go nuts. We can get the people who did October 7th. We can get the people who did it. We can get them extradited, imprisoned, put before trial, etc. And that Biden official says, I let him finish his speech. And then I said to him, are you done now? And he said, yes. And then I said to him, I ain't doing any of that. And I hung up. I ain't doing any of that. So basically, even when Egypt tried, it was rebuffed by the Americans. The Egyptians have been trying ever since to play a mediation role, but with something as simple as allowing food trucks into Gaza. So after October 7th, Egypt tries to allow food into Gaza through its own borders. And Israel's immediate reaction was to tell Egypt explicitly, if a single truck goes into Gaza through Egypt, we will bomb it immediately. And then Israel bombs the Rafah border crossing, the one between Gaza and Egypt. They bombed it 2 times within a couple of days to send a clear message to Egypt to keep it closed. So the only way that the Egyptians could get food into Gaza was to send it to Israel, and then it would have to go into Gaza through Israel. And it is this American veto by the Biden administration and now by the Trump administration that prevents Egypt from doing anything for Gaza. So no matter how much potential Egypt has to help Gaza at the moment, it is restrained by the Americans and the Israelis. Can you remind me, please, of the other question, Eric?
It was about the Egypt plan and what you personally think about it.
Yes, absolutely. So the Egyptian plan, again, it's not particularly perfect, but it builds on solid foundations. The idea there is to try to find a dignified way out for Palestinians and to try to give assurances for Israel of its security. Israel is the only country on earth that has a doctrine called preventative security. Preventative security means that it's like the movie with Tom Cruise that is called Minority Report. So you predict that this person may or may not attack you in, let's say, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, a decade, or you predict that this country, Iran or Syria or Lebanon, may attack you in the next 10 years. So you go and bomb them immediately. This is called preventative security. There's no basis whatsoever for this in international law, but it is basically an Israeli doctrine. So the Egyptians were trying to find a middle ground there. And they said, as I mentioned earlier, we would go into Gaza and collect all of the unexploded mines and Israeli bombs, etc., to prevent Hamas from rearming. Because Hamas's main source of weaponry is recycling Israeli bombs that did not explode, Israeli ammunition. So they said, we're going to take all of this out. And we are going to put an independent, technocratic Palestinian government in charge of Gaza that is not Hamas and not Fatah and not the Palestinian Authority, a new technocratic government. And they said, we will try to have a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire. And in that permanent ceasefire, 0 attacks from Palestinians, none whatsoever, on the condition that there should be a reciprocity, no attacks from Israel. And in that period, we build trust and we try to kickstart a 2-state solution. So that is the Egyptian plan in a nutshell. It had other components about relief, reconstruction. It was pretty detailed. It had a map of what Gaza would look like, etc. But all of those were flexible and subject to Palestinian input. The plan explicitly said that Palestinians are the owners of this territory. The occupied territory belongs to them. So Palestinians should decide. And that the Palestinian Authority should be the legitimate authority representing Gaza. Whereas the Trump plan is saying that Donald Trump is the legitimate authority. Donald Trump is the sovereign that should represent and run and decide on everything that has to do with Gaza. So that's a key difference between them. I think the plan is available online in both English and Arabic, so people can look it up. But as I said, in a nutshell, it is a middle ground. It's like a bridging proposal. It is to try to find some room to attract an Israeli acceptance, and Israel rejected it out of hand. The problem is that even with the Trump plan, when the Trump plan came out, and it is the best plan that Israel can ever imagine, even then, there is an Israeli newspaper called Ma'arif. I have this daily routine of reading every Israeli newspaper twice a day, 2 hours in the morning, 2 in the evening. So Ma'arif published an article quoting a senior Israeli official that said, if Hamas accepts this Trump plan, it would be a disaster for Israel. It would be a disaster for Israel, simple. Because Israel would have to allow food into Gaza, they would have to allow medicine, they would have to allow ABC. Even with the Trump plan, Israel is doing everything possible to prevent it from being completed or from moving from phase 1 to phase 2, because phase 2 is the one that has to do with reconstruction. And no Israeli government would stay in office a single day if a single video comes out of Gaza being rebuilt. Israel spent, I think the figure was about $100 billion and sacrificed about 900 soldiers and spent 750 days pulverizing Gaza and turning it into dust. And in that process, it destroyed its international reputation, its diplomatic standing, its economic standing. And they're not, after all of this, after all they put to turn Gaza into dust, they're not going to simply say, okay, you got us, let Gaza be rebuilt and people be allowed to live again. They are doing already everything possible to prevent the Trump plan from happening. So imagine what they would do to the Egyptian plan. That is the problem that we have at the moment. The window of hope that I have is that specific members of Congress, so that is Elizabeth Warren, Chris Van Hollen, Bernie Sanders, and a few others, wrote a public letter jointly condemning the Trump plan and raising suspicions about possible illegalities and irregularities and corruption that is included and embedded in the way that this plan is being executed. So I would say the way to go is to keep hammering on this until, like with Trump, the way that Israelis learn to play him like a violin is that they know he gets bored quickly, he gets disengaged quickly. If you make anything more complicated than 2 bullet points in a briefing, he would fall asleep. So the point is, keep hammering, keep making noise as much as possible against this plan until Trump realizes that it's giving him too much headache. He needs to move on to the next thing.
I've got a couple more themes here. One is and I know you'll want to talk about this. What is your view of Hamas, and what should our view of Hamas be?
Well, my view of Hamas would be biased because my entire family are Fatah. As I said, my parents came to Gaza through the Oslo process. Although that process was a sham and it was flawed, it allowed me to have a Palestinian identity. At the same time, I'm not blindly supportive of Fatah, and I'm not blindly critical of Hamas in absolute terms. I'm a political analyst, so it's my job to provide nuance. And in the name of nuance, Hamas is a multi-layered group. It has an armed wing, the Qassam Brigades. It has a political wing, a political party. It runs the government in Gaza, and it has a number of charity, civil society organizations, and it even has a university that is recognized in both the United States and in Europe. It's called the Islamic University of Gaza. It was founded by Hamas leaders, although it is independent from the group or the political leadership of Hamas. It is independent and autonomous, but it was founded by Hamas. So it is multiple things. Hamas as a government is not particularly popular with people in Gaza. And it is for the simple reason that if you try to portray yourself as a freedom fighter, now taking it from Hamas's perspective, if Hamas tries to portray itself as freedom fighters, and then they hand you a parking ticket or a traffic ticket, or they hike up taxes on food and water and basic goods, or they come to collect bills, or they come to put someone in prison, or they crack down on journalists, etc. These violations are well documented by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. You're not going to be a popular government because you are claiming to be a sacred freedom fighter, and you're handing me a parking ticket. You're handing me a tax bill. You're handing me a giant bill that is asking me to pay an astronomical fee because I crossed a jaywalked through a red light or something like this. So you're not going to be popular. And they're not popular because they are internationally boycotted and sanctioned. So as long as they remain in charge of Gaza, Israel would continue to sanction, isolate, besiege, starve, and destroy Gaza. So that's why people want Hamas to leave government. Hamas itself agreed to leave government multiple times. In 2014, when Eric and I were corresponding during the war started because Hamas had agreed to leave government. They signed a unity agreement with the Palestinian Authority, with Fatah. The Hamas government, the ministerial cabinet was disbanded. The prime minister of Hamas resigned. Every minister of Hamas resigned. So Netanyahu bombed Gaza immediately to kill that process. Hamas as a military group, there is twofold here. There is resentment. I have to be honest about this. There is resentment towards actions, the actions of Hamas's military wing. So, for example, before October 7th, there would be the resentment of the military wing of Hamas or other armed factions in Gaza firing projectiles on Israel that did not do much damage or pressure or destruction or achieve any tangible goal. And then Israel would use those projectiles as a pretext to pummel Gaza to the ground. Norman Finkelstein would say and said in his book a verbatim quote that I remember, and it was, "Do Palestinians have the right to symbolically resist slow death punctuated by periodic massacres unleashed by Israel, or should they die in silence?" So that was his rationale about Hamas's projectiles. There is a Hamas leader called Saleh Haruri. He was the deputy head of the group, and he had a leaked audio in 2020 in which he said, the verbatim quote was, "Armed resistance in Gaza displayed heroic examples, but it failed to produce results. Each time we went to an escalation with Israel, it ended up the same way. A ceasefire being signed, a promise of lifting the blockade. As soon as the ceasefire goes into effect, Israel keeps the blockade, Israel violates the ceasefire, and it's a matter of time before the next round." So his conclusion is, why should we provoke, or why should we give Israel a pretext? So that's one level about the armed faction of Hamas. And there is resentment about October 7th. There is the basic question of what was Sinwar trying to achieve? It remains a conundrum. Was Sinwar thinking, did he believe that October 7th would break the siege of Gaza? Did he not anticipate that Israel would turn Gaza into a howling wilderness and a wasteland? Did he hope that October 7th would liberate Palestine? There is a lot of questions of what was he hoping to achieve? And it is questions that Palestinians are asking. There is a lot that Hamas has said and Hamas supporters have said about why they did it. So they said Gaza was unlivable. People were doomed to slow death. We were in a permanent state of non-life. The West Bank was under daily Israeli incursions, settler terrorist attacks, etc. The Aqsa Mosque, Jerusalem, normalization with Saudi Arabia, Palestinian detainees and prisoners being starved and humiliated and beaten and violated and abused. They gave a lot of reasons why they did it, but they never gave a specific reason what were they hoping to achieve. And that is causing resentment. And there is, of course, the resentment towards how Hamas ran the negotiations after, if they could have done better, if they should have accepted the Trump terms earlier, etc. There's a lot of questions in that regard. So that is one layer. And as I said, like if you are an average person in Gaza that had I wouldn't say a good life, but had basically a roof on top of your head and food on the table, and now you're living on the street, the immediate reaction is, why? And the second thought would be cursing Israel. And the third thought in the back of your mind would be wishing that none of this had happened. It's basic human sentiment. It's the same with the Nat Turner slave rebellion. Back then, some of his contemporaries said that Nat Turner was a lunatic because things got a lot worse in the immediate aftermath of the slave rebellion. American overlords, white Americans, banned congregation for the slaves. They banned the teaching of the Bible. They banned any sort of group communion or prayer. They did all sorts of restrictions and revenge and lynchings. So it became a lot uglier. So people regretted the Nat Turner slave rebellion in the immediate aftermath. Netanyahu, however, has the same fear that white slavers in the US had, that the October 7th attack would be remembered like the Nat Turner rebellion, that although atrocities were committed, that it was part, as according to Netanyahu here is saying, he said, there is a risk that Palestinians would remember October 7th as their own war of independence. And the reason why he said that is that a lot of the Israeli propaganda narrative about what unfolded on October 7th is basically them telling what they did in 1948. So one specific piece of propaganda was Israel said that Hamas put a baby in an oven and baked him alive while torturing his family that were still alive watching the baby burn inside the oven. That story comes from the Deir Yassin massacre that Israel unleashed in 1948, before the Nakba, before the war, before any of this, where they rounded everyone in the village into a bakery and ordered the owner of that bakery to throw his son into the fire pit. And the owner said, no, I wouldn't do it. So the soldiers took him from his shoulders and threw him in the fire and threw the father after him. And one of the survivors told the testimony of him watching this firsthand. It's a very famous video that you can easily find on social media or YouTube. Just write Deir Yassin oven. So a lot of the atrocity propaganda were copied from there. That's why Netanyahu said they would remember it as their war of independence, which is an acknowledgement that Israel's war of independence was an atrocity. It was as atrocious as possible. There is the last element. So I said the element of resentment. There is the element of support towards the armed factions in Gaza, Hamas and other groups, preventing or making it at least more difficult for Israel and more costly for Israel to swallow Gaza and kick everybody out. So a very small anecdote. A young woman in Gaza, her name was Asala Munder Kullab. I'm not sure if she's alive or dead. I corresponded with her briefly at some point in 2024. And Asala's father, her father was killed by Hamas in 2007 during that short civil war between Hamas and Fatah. He was a police officer in Fatah in the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas insurgents killed him. And she saw this when she was only 7 years old. And she remembers yelling at Hamas militants, murderers, 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 over and over again. And she grew up hating Hamas with passion. And then after October 7th and after the genocide began, she wrote on social media publicly, although there is a huge risk to her life, she wrote, I am Asala Munder Kullab, the daughter of Colonel Munder Kullab, whom Hamas has murdered in 2007 before my eyes. I forgive Hamas and I choose to channel my hatred towards Israel. Because if Hamas is gone, Israel would have a much easier time kicking everyone out of Gaza. So now it becomes a distinction between Hamas as an offensive group attacking Israel, towards which there is resentment, there is mixed feelings, and Hamas as a deterrent or an insurgency. And genocide would naturally create a rallying around the flag effect in which people in Gaza, even if they disagreed with Hamas before, would say that they are the only people that have guns. So therefore, they are the only people that can fight back the Israelis inside Gaza. That's the same in Iran. After Trump went and bombed Iran and made the regime there stronger, his war created what is called a rallying around the flag effect. Even Iranians from the opposition that hate the regime didn't want to see their country bombed to the ground, their civilization ended. So it's the same sentiment. And the last sentiment is basically people supporting the existence of armed resistance in Gaza, or at least the existence of weapons in Gaza, not necessarily the use of those weapons. As I said, on October 7th, it evoked different sentiments and feelings. Some people saw it as a prison break. There was the picture of a bulldozer knocking down the Israeli fence of the Gaza concentration camp and people stampeding behind it. And basically, that was taken by a lot of Palestinians as the prison break moment. So there was that sentiment. There were the sentiments that I elaborated earlier of criticism towards what unfolded on that day. At the same time, the mere existence of weapons in Gaza is seen as the guarantee, even if it's a disparate, even if it's a minimal, even if it's a modest one, but it is the guarantee that Gaza would not become like the West Bank, that you wouldn't get Amiram bin Al-Uail walking into a village, burning an entire family, and then his friends dancing in front of your face, and his friends becoming the Israeli government and your neighbors at the same time. So that's why you see these, like, it's a multi-layered, complex, conflicted thought process about Hamas, where you see people in Gaza marching and protesting Hamas on the one hand, and at the same time saying, no, we don't want to be completely armless and defenseless. And I think people in the US would understand this much easier. The Second Amendment in the US is sacred. If you can convince the NRA, the National Rifle Association, to ban automatic rifles, you would have the same success with getting all the weapons out of Gaza. And Americans are not under an existential threat. It's just because they love guns. In Gaza, like if you come now to Gaza to a moment where Israel has turned it into a combination of Mad Max, Fallout, Squid Games, Hunger Games, Minority Report, it's a dystopian wasteland where the strong survives. And you are a person now sitting in this lawless chaos that Israel created, and your only guarantee for safety for you and your family is a pistol or a kitchen knife. And then Israel comes in and says, hand it to me. Do you think your family members, your neighbors would support this? It's like a very intuitive question. So it is a very sort of complicated element to reflect on. At the same time, I would say if a secular liberal Palestinian group emerges that is allowed to bear arms, it would get way more support than Hamas. Palestinians are overwhelmingly modern. They're very highly educated. They're not radical. They're not fundamentalists. And if they get, like, it's one question that was once posed to a Hamas leader. He was asked, why do you use indiscriminate rockets, basically dumb, unguided projectiles against Israel? And he said, well, if you give us guided munition, the same that the US supplies to Israel, we promise you we will only bomb the most criminal military targets. So it's the same question for Palestinians. If you give us an armed group that is so saint-like, that is composed of Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, the overwhelming majority of Palestinians would support it. Not even this. If you give Palestinians an option for a viable option for nonviolence, if you tell Palestinians that nonviolent resistance would liberate you, they would dump Hamas immediately, without a second thought. Even Hamas itself would dump its own weapons immediately. And we saw this in Gaza in 2019. It was called the Great March of Return, where Hamas members, even the sons of Ismail Haniyeh, the top leader of Hamas, were marching to the fence, Israel's apartheid fence, every Friday, unarmed, bare-chested, only carrying a Palestinian flag, not a Hamas flag, a Palestinian flag, and demanding the right to life. And Israel shut them down systematically. I think it's Kennedy that said, those who make non-violent resistance, non-violent peaceful resistance, those who make peaceful resistance impossible, make violent resistance inevitable. So that is the common Palestinian view on this topic.
Mohammed, I want to bounce off that real quickly because, and then I want to wrap it up with one theme of question I think is real important. But you knew Ismail Haniyeh, and when he was assassinated, what was your impression of where it was all going? Was he somebody who was a a force for good, or in his assassination makes things worse, or was it something else?
Well, I think the immediate indication about this is the Biden administration itself condemning the killing of Haniya and saying that it's unhelpful. So if he was a hardliner or an extremist, I don't think the Biden administration would condemn his assassination. The timing of the assassination happened when Haniya had just accepted the Biden ceasefire proposal. So the timeline is Haniya accepts the ceasefire proposal. Israel kills the top leader of Hamas's military faction in Gaza, Mohammed Shehada, and then a couple of weeks later bombs Haniya in Iran. So they killed him to sabotage the ceasefire. There's even an anecdote that I heard from a trusted Palestinian source that told me that the director of the American CIA, Bill Burns, had met with Haniya confidentially and discussed transitioning Hamas into a political group and putting the Palestinian cause on a path towards the two-state solution and transforming into the arena of nonviolent politics. And that they had a talk about this and they were beginning to explore it. And then Israel killed him immediately. So it is very much indicative of who he was and why Israel killed him. Haniya in Gaza was living his entire life in a refugee camp, in the Shati refugee camp. He grew up in a family that came from a village called Asqalan, Ashkelon, that Israel has now built on top of it a whole city in the same name, Ashkelon, after destroying every house left there. And he comes from a family of fishermen. A lot of his family members are not Hamas or are not enlisted in Hamas actively. For Haniya himself, his resume, as I said, he was not part of the military wing of Hamas. He was part of the political wing. He was the prime minister of Gaza, and he was the first Palestinian prime minister after the elections that the US had called for. And he was seen by Europeans, by Americans, as pragmatic. This is not my own opinion. This is America's opinion. So the US Institute of Peace, it's an organization funded by, I think, the Pentagon and the US Congress. They wrote a report in 2009 saying that Hamas was ready for peaceful negotiations and the two-state solution. In 2006, as soon as Haniya became prime minister, his first act in office was to send a letter to the Bush administration, to the White House, saying we are ready to lay down our arms and negotiate a Palestinian state. We would freeze the armed resistance and negotiate a state. So Americans and Europeans would always describe him as pragmatic. In Gaza itself, his background is that he grew up, my understanding is that he grew up an orphan. He studied Arabic literature. He became a very skilled oratorial or a speech maker. He worked at a Hamas charity called Al Mujamma Al Islami, and then ascended in the ranks of Hamas until he became prime minister, and then slowly after ascended in the ranks until he became the top leader of the group. With his assassination, I've seen immediately people from Fatah, from other Palestinian factions, like overwhelmingly from every single faction, that came out and condemned this. So it is very much indicative of what kind of person he is.
I want to thank you again. You are, truly a gift to the world in talking about this, and you're very generous with your time. It's what, 2:30 in the morning where you are, and we are really grateful. The library is going to throw us out soon, but there is one more thing that people want to know. They want to know how to support your work personally, and they want to know, actually it's the question I asked you the other day, is how can we get aid? How can we be part of getting aid and help into Gaza? And those will be the final questions.
in terms of getting aid into Gaza, there is many channels available at the moment. It depends if it is aid that you want to give to the collective population or to certain individuals. So to the collective, there is the United Nations UNRWA, the United Nations Work and Relief Agency for Palestinian Refugees, and that is the main channel for aid to Gaza, and it is in dire need for funding at the moment. So it would be the first one that comes to mind. There is others that are working in Gaza at the moment. The World Food Program, the World Health Organization, there's Oxfam, Save the Children, Doctors Without Borders. There is a group called Action Aid. There's a group called Dan Church Aid. There is Amnesty International in terms of documenting Israeli atrocities. There is an Israeli group called Gisha, Gisha. Gisha is an Israeli group of lawyers that challenge Israel's draconian restrictions on Gaza and takes it to the Supreme Court. They have a record of some successes here and there, and they are monumental in terms of documenting Israel's atrocities and genocide in Gaza. There is other organizations like the World Central Kitchen by Jose Anders, in which they have presence on the ground in Gaza. There is a group called the Gaza Soup Kitchen, which is a group that is Palestinian, organically Gazan, is run by Palestinians, and is on the ground. It's a grassroots group, the Gaza Soup Kitchen. There's a group called We Are Not Numbers, and that group specifically works with helping young people on basically becoming better than me at having good communication skills, narrating their own stories, storytelling, writing, etc. And with We Are Not Numbers, you can help them not just by donation, you can help by volunteering some of your time to become a mentor of a young person in Gaza, to help them in terms of how to narrate their stories, how to narrate what they've been through and their experiences, and give them your wisdom and long experience in life. Individual cases where you would like to help certain individuals in Gaza, there is the sort of the fundraising campaigns all over social media. So that is one way. And another way is the Bank of Palestine. It is more complicated and difficult and restricted because it operates under Israeli oversight. So it goes through a huge and insane lane of complications. There's been other ways to bypass. So GoFundMe and other similar platforms have been restricting Palestinian fundraising campaigns and removing some of them arbitrarily. So other ones have been created that could support in terms of individual campaigns of the sort. And it ranges from people that are in need of education, people in need of medical treatment, or just to put food on the table, or evacuation out of Gaza. Each case is worthy of consideration on its own merit.
And then how can we support your work? And you got 3 minutes.
I would say spreading the message as much as possible. I write articles in a number of publications. One is called The New Arab, one is called Zeteo, and one is called 972. It's an investigative newspaper that is led by anti-Zionist Israelis and Palestinians, and it has a phenomenal record uncovering Israeli atrocities. And I'm learning about something called Substack. I don't even know what it is, but I try to write there occasionally. I have an account on Twitter with some following. I think it's about 150,000 people on Substack. I think my audience there is in single digits at the moment. So maybe if you have the time to read what I write there, that would be appreciated. It would be a boost of my ego.
What is your Substack?
It's just my name.
What's it called? Just your name? Okay. Well, we are really grateful, and we'll give you a round of applause. Really,
Thank you.
really grateful for the time that you've given us and for the work that you do, and just for your spirit and everything that you have to teach us.
Thank you.
And again,
I really
we thank
appreciate it.
you, and maybe we'll do this again.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation,
So-
and I appreciate people's determination to stay until the end. And then thank you, Brother Eric, for all your support and your hard work to pull this and put it together.
Don's the guy you got to thank for that.
Thank you, Don, for this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And hope we
And our tech people. Yes.
absolutely. I'm very
Thank you.
grateful for your help with this, and hopefully we meet one day in person.
I hope so. I hope so.
I love your kufiya, by the way.
Thank you. This was actually a gift from a friend who passed away.
Ah, I'm
So
sorry that you're lost.
I have two of them. This one has a little bit of sentimental value. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.